Welcome to the Coach House Podcast, episode 12. On this episode, we have two of our authors in conversation about urbanism and changing cities. Kate Black, author of Big Mall, Shopping for Meaning, which looks at the history of the West Edmonton Mall, and Shawn Micallef, author of the newly updated edition of Stroll, our beloved book of Toronto walks and neighborhoods. We started by asking them about mall culture and how it has changed. I was hoping you could talk about some malls, other than the West Edmonton Mall, Kate, that were meaningful for you guys growing up, were personal, had some kind of connection like that, especially from childhood or other places you've lived throughout your life. Kate, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I guess the first mall that comes to mind is City Centre Mall in Edmonton. I guess like my first big girl adult job was working in downtown Edmonton, and I found working in an office kind of overwhelming. So I didn't actually go to that mall that often just to shop, but to get away and to wander. And so that liminal space was really important to me when I just needed some breathing room. And I guess now my equivalent to that is Pacific Centre Mall in Vancouver. I don't even shop there that much, but a lot of times it's like that just in between in your commute when you're connecting buses, or if you're just like walking around and like need to sit in a food court, eat something, go to the bathroom. I think that's my connection to urban malls, is that, you know, sometimes it's hard to just find a place to sit down and relax.
Shawn, do you have a favorite mall? Any mall come to mind?
Yeah, I love the mall. I worked in the mall in Windsor. I'm from Windsor, Ontario. And for 5 or 6 years, I was a mall rat, or working for the mall rats, I guess, at the uncoolest record store chain in Canada, Music World, which does not exist anymore.
Hell yeah.
The cool kids were all at Sam's and HMV. Anyway, I worked at the Windsor Mall for so long, and it gave me this kind of affection for the place. And when I moved to Toronto 25 years ago or so, I started visiting the malls, not by consciously, but they just were such familiar spaces, and I could kind of understand them. Like I like, downtown Toronto and big open main streets and all that, but visiting like the big malls, Eaton Centre, Yorkdale, to like the little neighborhood malls has been sort of a thing I've done. In Stroll, there's a bunch of those malls that I wander in and out of too. They're part of the like Canadian landscape as much as the mountains and the Great Lakes and the ocean and all that.
I was hoping we could connect the two coasts here on malls and something similar, because I as well lived in Vancouver briefly, Kate, and I'm aware of the Pacific Mall as well. But I grew up in Toronto when I was a teenager in an area called Riverdale. And we had a mall called Gerrard Square, which was sort of a half undead mall at that time. But this mall is burned into my psyche, and everywhere I go around Canada, there's this particular mall, which is not the Eaton Centre or a large mall, the West Edmonton Mall. This is in my mind, these malls are like maybe 2 stories, probably 1, right? They have 2 levels in there, but they're a very small mall. I was hoping are there any factors you think coast to coast in Canada from the malls you've seen that describe this mall, this Canadian urban mall, smaller, mid-sized community things? Is there anything that sticks out for you guys?
I don't know, I like what Shawn said about how malls are such an integral part of the Canadian landscape, like how they kind of fit seamlessly, maybe that's debatable, into the urban landscape, like how maybe it has something to do with just our climate here and how much of our year is spent in winter, like decreasingly so. But this need to have that pedway space, like connecting where people work with that transient space. I don't know, what do you think, Shawn?
Yeah, I mean, if you go, like Toronto has the Path Network, which is now up to 30 kilometers. And I have a chapter of the book kind of exploring the Path, which some people hate. Urbanists really hate it because it sucked life out of the main streets. But I kind of love it, especially.
What is the Path? People don't live in Toronto. Sorry to interject.
The PATH. It is an interconnected tunnel system, and some elevated, connecting 30 kilometers of downtown Toronto buildings from the lake, CN Tower area, all the way up to the Eaton Centre area, and kind of wider. And then there's little kind of mini paths up around different subway nodes. And Montreal has its own sort of path system, and Calgary and Edmonton too, and Vancouver of varying sizes. And like Kate says, it might be like this kind of climate thing. That it's even in Toronto and some places it's too hot in the summer, so I go down there for the air conditioning. And I recently visited Hong Kong for the first time, and it blew my mind that it is also an interconnected mall city. These kind of like office megaplexes that have arms over and under the roads, and I was like, oh, this is kind of Canadian, and it made me feel at home too.
That is cool. I like just these places like that are maybe thought of as non-places, like a mall, like that urbanists hate because they're so generic, but how you can find that home feeling wherever you go, like because of this seamlessness or the familiarity that it has. I just think that's interesting.
Yeah, and a lot of the malls, like James was saying, like Riverdale Mall, and some of, like, I'm thinking of Sheridan Mall on Wilson in North York here, and there's a bunch in Scarborough, a bunch in Etobicoke, that are sort of forgotten by the chains. There might be a few, like a Tim Hortons or H&R Block and that sort of thing. But because the rents are low, it gets populated by these sort of mom and pop independent stores, and it replicates in a way, not exactly the way, because the rules are different and there's no free speech or anything, but it replicates like going down the street and just seeing, all these indie shops.
Yeah.
They tend not to get written up, in the glossy magazines of the city and stuff, but that's why I think they're such interesting spaces as well.
Totally.
Kate, is there an equivalent of what Shawn's talking about in Vancouver or Edmonton?
Ooh. Yeah, definitely. Like the ones that come to mind in Edmonton are like Bonnie Doon Mall, has kind of been adopted by, like, I remember when I was in university, it was like cool to go to Bonnie Doon Mall because it was like so shitty. But it just had things, that felt real. Like it wasn't just, a huge space full of like H&Ms and like A&Ws, but there were spots that you could go that were only at Bonnie Doon Mall. I'm thinking about Vancouver. Have any of you ever been to Crystal Mall in Burnaby?
No.
It's wild. So it's right across the street from Metrotown. Like it's basically like threatened by Metrotown, which is one of the busiest malls in Canada. But Crystal Mall, I actually went there for the first time last weekend, and there's like no English signs, hardly any, in the space, and it is so busy. Like it's just full, like meat and fruit and fish, like just is the whole main level. And then the upper level is an entirely, like non-westernized food court. And it's just so interesting and important that space is here. It's wild to just go into a space like in Canada and it feels like being transported elsewhere. But it's like, of course, like this has been here like for centuries, this culture, in what is Vancouver. So I don't know. Yeah, just this mall that I don't think would be put on the map in the same way as Burnaby or as Metrotown, but plays a really vital role here.
Yeah, and some of them are being, like you said, kind of at risk because, they're in cities like Vancouver, Toronto, having all that parking is like a gold mine to
totally
develop. And in some places they might develop just the parking lot and keep the mall. But then the malls, because the people pay low rent and they can easily kind of just erase them off. So they're neat, unloved spaces, totally.
When these malls do close down, when the endangered malls do finally shut, because some do, what happens to the surrounding areas is something I'm kind of curious. Like, I know this is dependent on where we are geographically, but from what you two have seen, what can happen when these smaller or mid-sized malls collapse to the surrounding area, to the community?
Near where I live here in the west side of Toronto, there was the Galleria Mall, which was one of these second or third tier malls that some people made fun of. It's just being, it's a scary mall or whatever, which it was not. But when you'd walk around the Galleria Mall, it's all been redeveloped now. It's been mostly torn down, except for a little chunk of it, which will eventually go, and being redeveloped as towers, and kind of open air spaces. And when you'd walk around it before, there were always groups of, often old men, but not always old men, just hanging out, right? It became this sort of four-season community space. The food courts in these malls are what in, I don't know, Europe, it would be like a town square, a piazza. but it's in a food court. So it looks different, but it's providing the same function. And the Galleria Mall was sort of was destroyed, and where are all these kind of people hanging out now? So it despite it not being true public space, you can't have a protest there, etc., etc. It is a loss of community space. Mm-hmm. Cheap community space where, you know, they didn't really make anyone buy anything. At Music World in Windsor in the 90s, it was right in front of the food court of Devonshire Mall. And I would sit and see a lot of the old people just sitting there, and they would nurse a Tim Hortons double for like hours, and no one would move them along. So it kind of established a sort of safe equilibrium.
Yeah, totally. I was thinking similar things. One of the malls that I write about in the book is Morningside Mall in Scarborough. And yeah, I think it's interesting to talk about the malls as definitely imperfect public spaces. Like, yeah, you can't protest if mall security decides that you're loitering. Like, you could be banned from never coming back to that space. But Morningside Mall even took that to the next level and had you know, like actual community services would rent spaces in the mall. So there's like a conversation group for like Tamil seniors and a lot of stuff focused around the senior community. And so when that mall was torn down and replaced with a condo building, it's hard to imagine, you know, those kinds of interactions taking place. Yeah, like in a multiplex. Yeah, it's sad.
Yeah, I was at a community center across from Albion Mall, so Rexdale, North Etobicoke, a few years ago, and it was the City of Toronto Community Center, and the person who ran the community center said the manager of Albion Mall came over one day and said, like, do you guys have something for seniors to do? Because we have too many seniors hanging out in the mall, which is a message that, like, you know, officials should listen to, like, oh, we don't have enough places for old people to hang out without, you know, having to pay rent and buy stuff just to hang out. So they're sort of seeing those mall spaces are sort of like bellwethers of, do we have enough actual public space for people to hang out in? Yeah,
and I think that's the bigger issue that it points towards. Like I appreciate the role that malls have played in our society over the past 50 years, like in filling that gap. But I think, like, as you say, it points to the need that we need public space. Ideally, that's not as fickle as, like, you know, a developer can come along and, you know, make more capital out of this space. Like, public space should be public and publicly funded to some degree.
We've talked a lot about malls around us and local malls and stuff, but sort of to go back what Shawn was saying about Hong Kong, I was wondering about how malls are doing internationally as well. Are they doing better? I guess we're talking a lot about the struggle of malls here too, especially sort of these mid-size or smaller malls. But do those exist other places in the world? Are they doing okay? Are we building more malls elsewhere? This is sort of what I wonder.
Hong Kong runs the gamut between, like, the most luxury malls where you see, like, Louis Vuitton all over the place, and these older ones that date to the 70s and maybe the 80s. One of them that I really wanted to go see in Kowloon that I made a point of see was Chungking Mansions. There was that movie in the 80s, late 80s, Chungking Express, that sort of took place around the same area. But it's basically a skyscraper on a busy street, 10 stories, 12 stories. And all the way up, you just go up the elevator or the escalators on the lower floors, and there's stuff. There's little kind of kiosks, little tiny stores, people doing cell phone stuff. You know, as I read about how Chungking Mansions has changed, people are like, it's sketchy now or whatever, you could buy drugs there. But walking through, it's like I suddenly understood how some of the malls along Spadina in Toronto's Chinatown, or along Shepherd and Asian Court in Scarborough, kind of developed from this kind of Hong Kong model. And they're still busy places, and you can still kind of get stuff done. I think that's one of, like, the things of gentrification. Like, can you get you know, errands done in a gentrified neighborhood? Can you get your snow tires changed? Can you buy a hammer? And you can do those things at these malls. Maybe not get your snow tires changed at a Hong Kong mall. That was a bad example. But, you know, like, they were like all these kind of useful things. So it was neat to see that.
One thing that I learned through writing the book is that the most currently successful and biggest and like well-frequented malls aren't in North America, but are in Asia and the Middle East. I guess there's like a lot of reasons for that, but one of them also points towards like climate, like especially as climate becomes more extreme. Like imagining in the Middle East, like there's malls that have like ski hills in them, like these like just mega malls that also like kind of like Westhampton Mall like are a magnet for tourism, but are also kind of a climate shelter where you can, you know, get all this stuff done, but also it's a respite from whatever is going on outside.
Mm-hmm. I thought when I've been to England, in London in particular, it also has like those kind of forgotten malls, you know. Mm-hmm. Elephant and Castle was one I went in the kind of South London, and I thought I was in Toronto. I thought I was in Galleria Mall or Sheridan Mall, or you could even be Morningside Mall. So those parallels all over the place.
Yeah, you can find home everywhere.
I was wondering about the future of malls, particularly in cities moving forward. Obviously, there's still malls being built, they're still of use, but a lot of this is outside big urban centers and stuff. So in cities themselves, are malls still being built? Do they have use? What do you think of the future of the urban mall is? Because these are the ones we find shutting more than others, or at least perhaps I'm off on that. But from what I see, it's the urban malls, the downtown malls in Toronto that are closing down. Things around the GTA, the Greater Toronto Area, can actually be thriving in some ways. But the closer you get to home, I find, or even larger cities, that's when stuff's shutting down. Shawn? Yeah,
the future of malls. I mean, we build malls, but we don't call them malls. I wrote in the Toronto Star column I write, I wrote about in December about the Well, which is a new giant development in Toronto at the foot of Spadina, close to the lake. And it's a bunch of towers, but it has what's essentially a mall, but they don't call it a mall. It's sort of indoor-outdoor space with shops, multi-leveled. I mean, and as I was writing it, I'm like, in North America, for North Americans to understand a space like this, we have to call it a mall. But the developers are very like, it's not a mall, it's something else, it's something new. They didn't call it lifestyle center, but you know, there's this resistance to the mall. The mall like has this stigma to it. But the mall is the mall, and people will go to it if they kind of understand that language about how the place works. So there are new ones going. I think like there's this another place in Toronto over the last 15 years, and I had to update Stroll for this because when I wrote the first edition of it, it was sort of in flux, and now it's been there for 14, 15 or more years, is the Shops at Don Mills, which was this old kind of second, third tier mall that got transformed into a somewhat luxury but outdoor kind of mall space, trying to be a kind of old-fashioned town street. You walk from shop to shop, there's a town square, it's all outdoors. But I don't know if it's as successful as the developers wanted it to be, because it's sort of trying to be something it's not, which is a truly public space. Whereas a mall is like you're going inside some business's building. You kind of like, even though we use it as public space, maybe there's this understanding that it's not real public space because you got to deke out the security guards that Kate was talking about.
Kate, how do you see the future of malls?
Man, I wish I knew. I wish I knew what's going to happen. But I think, it's along the lines of what Shawn's saying, is that it's almost like the mall is becoming us, or like the mall is, leaving the mall and entering everything. I think about how many just like gentrified, developments now call themselves villages. Like I was just staying in Calgary's East Village, and by that name you would think it's like the West Village, where it's like people are just like walking around having coffee and sitting outside, and it's like, it's condos and Shoppers Drug Mart and a Loblaws, and to me that feels like a mallification of our public space, but we're not going to call that a mall, even though the way the space is organized is like literally around buying stuff. Like, what are we going to do with that huge Loblaws space if that ever goes away? Like, that's a permanent part of this infrastructure, but we're not going to call it a mall. For some reason, we're going to call it a village, even though, no one's really looking each other in the eyes here. And even though there isn't mall security, it's like a heavily policed presence. There's certain kinds of behavior that's still not allowed in this village, that's just like centered around a Shoppers and a Superstore. So I think that might be kind of like my pessimistic outlook on the future of urban malls and malls in general. But I think returning to one of the other things we were talking about, like, I hope the future of the mall in some way involves some sort of public investment in public space, like knowing that even if the malls that we grew up with went away, like they all point towards, the importance of human connection, and that humans seek out this connection even in spaces that are built around our consumption.
Real quick before we go, I was hoping you guys could both share your favorite memory of your childhood mall, your favorite childhood mall, the one thing, be it a store, an experience, a kiosk, whatever you may be.
Okay. I guess this one is on my mind because it's on the book, so it's the one I've like fleshed out in my mind with the most sensory detail. But it was when I was in grade 9, and it was always a thing, like, our schools would reward us if we had good attendance and good grades with a trip to Westhampton Mall, and you could choose going to the water park, Galaxyland, or Reds, like the arcade inside. And in grade 9, it was just like debauchery, because we were just like in that space of like people were starting to like date, and like it was the first time we were really out there without adults. And I just remember people were making out in the wave pool, like we had like waterproof disposable cameras. Like I felt like a socialite. It was like the best day ever. That was my best mall memory.
Oh my god. There was a second tier mall in Windsor called Tecumseh Mall. It always had which was always confusing, the second tier malls, because they also had their own Santa Clauses. It's like, how are there two Santa Clauses? Anyway, it had this one store, and I don't remember what store it was, but in like kind of the front window, it was like a cool waterfall with like little plants growing and everything. It was very exotic, and it had this kind of wrought iron fence, and we'd always go up and look at it. And one time we went through the mall, and some other little kid like us who wanted to see it stuck their head through and got stuck, and all the firemen were there trying to get the kid's head out of the gate. And it was like this beautiful, wondrous thing of childhood suddenly turned bad. I think the kid was fine. Yeah, they greased the kid up and it came out. I don't know. I still go back and I'm like, which store was that spooky, that waterfall that captured that kid?
There's a metaphor in there. Yeah. The jaws of adulthood. Yeah.
Kate, Shawn, thank you for appearing on the Coach House podcast.
Thanks, James. This is fun.
Thank you so much.
That was our episode. Thank you for listening. This episode was produced by Andrew Kaufman. My name is James Lindsay, and this episode was printed by Mindless Acid Freaks. Thank you for listening.